so it's been able to be introduced to animals in a laboratory, inducing a spontaneous abortion, and then re-extracted and cultured. So it appears to be linked with spontaneous abortions. So it is being evaluated. The reason I'm talking about it now, even though it's supposed to be secret, is that the letter that was sent to Secretary Vilsack was leaked onto the internet, and that's why we're talking about it. Normally, this type of information would be exposed to a lot more research before it was made public. The fifth possible problem is that genes inserted into GM crops might transfer to our gut bacteria or into our own DNA. The only human feeding study ever conducted, brilliant study, took 7 human volunteers. They had ileostomy bags. They had their lower intestines removed, not for the study. They fed them a soy burger and a soy milkshake and looked inside the ileostomy bag, and there, lo and behold, they were surprised to find how much intact genetically modified soy had survived passage through the stomach and small intestine. But in 3 of the 7 volunteers, before they were fed the meal, embedded in the DNA of their gut bacteria was the gene that had been found in the bacteria in the chemical waste dump near Monsanto's factory. In other words, they had eaten genetically modified soy in some previous time, and this was in the UK, where they don't eat a lot of GM soy. And the gene had jumped into the DNA of their gut bacteria. And it was in there on a stable basis with the promoter, which is the on switch, and they had Roundup-ready gut bacteria. Now, this may give a survival advantage to bacteria when we have so much Roundup in our diet that normally has antibacterial properties. So the Roundup in our diet may be stripping us of bacteria except that which has the Roundup-ready gene, so we may be colonizing the gut bacteria of North Americans. Now, if you eat a corn chip, and the corn chip has been made with BT corn, which is highly likely, and that gene would also transfer, and no one has studied to see if BT genes transfer, but if it does, it might turn our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories. And BT is known to break open the stomach of insects and kill them, and some people believe it may be linked to leaky gut. Now let's take a look at GM soy, just to see if there's evidence of problems. Now, soon after GM soy was introduced to the UK, the York Laboratory reported an increase of soy allergies by 50%. No follow-up was done to see if GM soy was the culprit. But there are many reasons why it might be. When GM soy was fed to mice, there was a dramatic reduction in enzymes produced in the pancreas. If it takes longer to digest protein, it gives longer time to produce an allergic response. One study that needs to be repeated with better controls showed a new allergen in GM soy. We already discussed the 7-fold increase in trypsin inhibitor, a known allergen in GM soy. Herbicide residues are increased. Even the Roundup-ready protein that's intended to be in the soy has properties of a dust mite allergen. And that is the one that's continuously produced inside our gut, possibly triggering allergic reactions on a continuous basis. Here's a picture of the liver of rats on the right that were fed GM soy compared to those on the left. Testicles changed from pink to blue in male rats fed GM soy. I'll let that one sink in. Mice fed GM soy had changes in their testicles, including damage to the young sperm cells. Female rats fed GM soy had changes in the uterus and ovaries and hormonal balance. Offspring of GM-fed mice had changes in the way the DNA functioned in the embryos. I gave a talk at the EU Parliament a few years ago with Irina Ermakova, a senior researcher of the Russian Academy of Sciences. She gave me these slides. They're Russian-speaking rats. They volunteered for a soy feeding experiment in which, starting 2 weeks before they got pregnant, they were fed GM soy, and it continued through pregnancy and lactation, and more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks, compared to a 10% death rate of the group who was fed non-GM soy. There was also a change in the size. Many of the GM-fed group were quite a bit smaller. And in a subsequent study, they were unable to reproduce. Now, as is typical of researchers who find adverse findings, Dr. Ermakova was attacked victimized, and she told me her boss was under pressure from his boss, so she couldn't do any more GMO studies. One of her colleagues tried to actually comfort her by saying, well, maybe the GM soy will solve the overpopulation problem. One of the appropriate criticisms of her research was that she never did a biochemical analysis of the feed. So we don't know if there was some toxin in her particular bag of soy flour that she used that might have caused the astounding results. But after doing it 3 times with similar results, coincidentally, the entire facility switched to a GM soy-based rat chow. So she asked her colleagues after 2 months, what's your infant mortality rate? And it had skyrocketed to over 55%, suggesting it wasn't a particular toxin in her feed. In another Moscow experiment, also Russian Academy of Sciences, hamsters fed GM soy over 2 years. By the 3rd generation, most lost the ability to have babies. They grew at slower growth rate, 5-fold increase in infant mortality. Some had hair growing in their mouths. If GM crops are so bad, why don't we see more problems? Well, the L-tryptophan epidemic gives us a hint why not. It took 4 years to discover the epidemic, and yet it was screaming to be discovered. The symptoms had 3 simultaneous characteristics: new, acute, and fast-acting. All 3 had to be in place for them to identify the cause of the epidemic. What if it was not new symptoms? What if it were cancer or heart disease? No one would check to see if you're taking L-tryptophan. What if it were mild symptoms like frequent colds or memory loss? Or memory loss? Or what if it was like the hamsters where it took the 3rd generation to show the sterility? So what about the GM crops on the market? When they were introduced in 1996, 7% of Americans had 3 or more chronic illnesses. 9 years later, 13%. Food-related illnesses doubled between 1994 and 2001. Reproductive problems are on the rise. Gastrointestinal problems are on the rise. Autism, food allergies, inflammation, etc. We can't responsibly say that GMOs are the cause or a contributor, but we can't responsibly say they're not, because there's no post-marketing surveillance, no human clinical trials, no proper evaluation of all the changes that occur. Approvals are based on assumptions, many of which have been proven false, and on industry research, much of which is rigged to avoid finding problems. So I'd now like you to rate yourself from 1 to 100, how vigilant you'll be next week at avoiding genetically modified foods. So how many people will be low vigilance? 1 to 20. Raise your hand, 1 to 20. 20 to 40. 40 to 60. 60 to 80. 80 to 100. Some difference there.
How do you know?
Yes, how do you know? I have a non-GMO shopping guide for every one of you at the book table outside. And there's also packets of them if you want to give for your patients. How active do you wish to be? Now, before I talk about how active do you plan to be on educating patients on GMOs, I want to share with you, since one of the themes today is actually getting people out there and doing something to change the structure of our health. It turns out that getting rid of GMOs is not that difficult. Remember the potato study and Dr. Arpad Pusztai? Well, when his gag order was lifted, 750 articles were written within a single month, and 10 weeks later, the tipping point of consumer rejection was achieved. And within 1 week, virtually every major food company committed to stop using GM ingredients in Europe, but not here. We think as little as 5% of U.S. shoppers avoiding GM brands could create a tipping point. Why? Because GMOs offer no consumer benefits. The same companies that are selling us GMOs here have already taken them out of Europe and Japan. They can replace GMOs without even changing their recipe, just going to the non-GM corn and soy. So we believe that by inspiring as little as 5%, and maybe we're off in our numbers a little bit, but it won't be much, we could end the genetic engineering of the food supply. So I add that as an extra motivation to participate, and I want to ask you now how active you would plan now to be in educating patients about how to avoid GMOs. So how many people plan to be particularly low? 1 to 20, raise your hand. 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. So we just saw in 41 minutes how to end the genetic engineering of the food supply by telling people the truth. And it's not just doctors. I asked the same question to farmers, to food service directors, to parents, to lawyers, and they all, well, the lawyers have to be paid. Everyone changes their diet on the spot when they discover the problems. So our whole plan has 3 pillars of messaging. 1, the health dangers. 2, how to avoid GMOs. And you can also, here's the shopping guide you can get. You can also go to iPhone application Shop No GMO, or go to our website, nongmoshoppingguide.com. How to avoid GMOs and the fact that a tipping point can get rid of GMOs. So that's how we think we can end the genetic engineering of the food supply, and it's already happening with bovine growth hormone. We're part of a coalition that has been educating people about the health dangers. Bovine growth hormone has been condemned by the American Public Health Association, condemned by the American Nurses Association, banned in Canada, banned in Europe and Japan and Australia and New Zealand, and now it's banned in Walmart's milk, and in Dannon and Yoplait and Starbucks, and most American dairies. And it never enjoyed the high-profile coverage that occurred in Europe. It was passed by healthcare practitioners and health-conscious shoppers and parents of young kids. So it demonstrates that a tipping point can occur in the United States associated with genetically modified products. And in fact, it's already happening. The Nielsen survey in 2009 said the fastest growing store brand claim was non-GMO. Year to date, it's the 3rd fastest overall health claim on packaging of products sold in grocery stores. In fact, Supermarket News said in 2009 that 2010 would show an unprecedented upsurge of consumer awareness and concern about GMOs, and that's what happened. I've been traveling around the United States for 8 years, speaking on the health dangers. I have never seen such an upswell of educated, concerned, and active consumers and physicians. I go to doctors' offices where they prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient. They give out our audio CDs to every patient. They have our text. They have our videos. They play videos while people are getting IVs. Talk about a captive audience. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine, in May of 2009, urged all doctors to prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient, citing reproductive problems, immune system problems, accelerated aging, dysfunctional regulation of cholesterol and insulin, organ damage. I talked to doctors like John Boyles, who said, I used to test for soy allergies all the time, but now that it's genetically engineered, it's so dangerous, I tell my patients never to eat it unless it's organic. We believe that education is the key, so we have been strategically designing education to do the reach out so that individuals don't have to become experts. So we have the right brain book, the left brain book, the audio, the podcast, the series of articles, etc. But we're also teaching people to speak on GMOs. We've taught 450 people in the last 12 months to speak on GMOs in one-day workshops and 4-part webinars. And so we would like to invite you to help end the genetic engineering of the food supply simply by helping your patients understand the risks and make healthier non-GMO choices. So we have non-GMO health risks brochures, which you're able to take a free one at the booth, at the bookstore at the end of this lecture. And you can also sign up for our free electronic newsletter, Spilling the Beans, or leave your business card so we can tell you more information as it comes on. And for all the references in this talk, I refer you to Genetic Roulette, which is written as a 2-page spread. The left side is a summary for the attention deficit politician. The right side is the cited detailed text. So what I see now is an amazing opportunity. Because GMOs give no consumer benefits, because these companies have taken them out already, and because we now have sufficient evidence that simply by telling the truth, we can change people's diet on the spot, we can take back our food supply and together reclaim a non-GMO world. Thank you very much.
Jeffrey Smith presents the politics of GMOs.
In order to discuss the politics of GMOs, you have to discuss the politics of Monsanto, because they are the big bully on the block that's put it forward. I imagine that Monsanto, in its quieter, tender moments, asks itself, what would Darth Vader do? If you look at the history of Monsanto, you see the most toxic products in history. Agent Orange Monsanto was one of the producers there. And according to an EPA memo from Kate Jenkins in 1990, Monsanto submitted false information to the EPA, which directly resulted in weakened regulations. And their tampered research was the basis of why Vietnam veterans and their children were denied compensation. Instead of investigating Monsanto, they investigated Kate Jenkins and made her life hell. Monsanto introduced PCBs, insulation material for electrical devices, and it has spread all over the world. It is a horrible poison. They were continually poisoning the people living next to their factory, and they got convicted of outrage. What an incredible name. According to Alabama law, it requires behavior so outrageous in character and extreme in degree as to go beyond all possible bounds of decency, so as to be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in civilized society. They nailed Monsanto in that. And Monsanto got fined $700 million. Now, in terms of Monsanto politics, the messiah of GMOs was Robert Shapiro. And he came from G.D. Searle, which produced aspartame. So it gives you a good idea of his background. And the person who was his boss was Donna Rumsfeld. And aspartame, how many people know about the dangers of aspartame? All right, so good. We've been doing a good job. If you don't know, just Google aspartame symptoms and camp out for a few hours, and you'll never touch aspartame again. Now, Robert Shapiro was the one that created the myth that GMOs would be good for the planet, which is why you should make Monsanto rich. And so he would write all these things. And there was a young man in California named Kirk Azevedo, and he was being recruited by Monsanto to be their salesperson in California. And he started reading the words of Robert Shapiro and got very excited. And on that basis, he took a position. So in the employee orientation meeting in St. Louis, he got up and told his fellow employees how excited he was and started quoting feeding the world and bettering the planet and turning fields into chemical producing and pharmaceutical producing areas. And after the meeting, a vice president pulled him over and said, wait a minute. What Robert Shapiro says is one thing. What we do is something else. He's the front man that tells the story. We don't even know what he's talking about. We're here to make money. So this explains the inner politics, what we tell the world and what we really do. Later, Kirk Azevedo learned from some colleagues in Monsanto that there were some proteins that had been produced in the cotton from the process of genetic engineering that were never there in normal cotton. And they didn't know which proteins they were or if they were dangerous. But they were still feeding the cottonseed cakes to the dairy cows living down the street from Kirk's house. At this point, Kirk had been studying prion disease and mad cow disease and things like that. And he said, well, you know, if cows eat things that are dangerous, it might affect those that drink the milk or eat the meat. We should probably characterize these proteins to see if they're safe. And they said, we've always fed the products of our field trials to the public, and we're going to continue to do it. And they didn't even know what mad cow was. So he tried to blow the whistle, and he went to university professors in California, agricultural commissioners. They said their eyes just glazed over. They had no idea that the process of genetic engineering could create unpredicted side effects. So he left the company, became a chiropractor, and just took the GMO speaker training course with us. When Fox News was going to blow the whistle on bovine growth hormone, link it to cancer, a threatening letter from Monsanto's attorney promising dire consequences to Rupert Murdoch and Fox ultimately canceled the series. It's interesting that when documents were stolen from the FDA and later made public, it showed that Monsanto scientists, when they wanted to show that injections of bovine growth hormone did not interfere with the fertility of cows, they allegedly added cows to the study that were pregnant before they were ever injected. When scientists wanted to show that the pasteurization process destroys the bovine growth hormone in the milk, they pasteurized the milk 120 times longer. But they only destroyed 19% of the hormone, so they added powdered hormone to the milk. 147 times the amount of normally occurring hormone was added to the milk in powdered form. They then heated it 120 times longer than normal, and only under those rigged conditions were they able to destroy 90% of the hormone. So what did the FDA report? Pasteurization destroys 90% of the hormone. In Canada, from Health Canada is their FDA, Shiv Chopra and others reported that they were being pressured to approve bovine growth hormone, that they were unable to access documents, that documents were stolen from a locked file cabinet, and that Monsanto offered them a bribe of $1 to $2 million to approve it without further study. When that hit CBC, when they announced it, Monsanto said, oh, they must have misunderstood an offer for research money. And they did, in fact, get indicted and convicted of offering bribes to at least 140 Indonesian officials at the same time to try and approve their genetically modified cotton. Now you take this background of Monsanto and you combine it with the FDA and you have a really lethal dose. Let me read you a testimony from someone in the FDA describing what really happens in that agency. He said, this is from 1976, no one knew where anything was. There was absenteeism. There was open drunkenness by several employees, which went on for months. There was intimidation internally. People, I'm talking about division directors and their staffs, would engage in a kind of behavior that invited insubordination. People tittered in the corners, throwing spitballs. Now I'm describing physicians. People would slouch down in their chairs and not respond to questions. This was the kind of behavior I have not seen in any other institution from a grown man. And then it got worse. Between 1976 and 1985, more than half of the FDA drug approvals turned out to have lethal or serious side effects and had to have withdrawal or added label warnings. And around the middle of this time, Reagan came in and started changing the attitude in the FDA from regulation to approval. There was a rush to get things approval, so it got worse even from here. So today, in a study released in September, a survey of FDA employees, one person said in the FDA, food safety has succumbed to the higher priority of global corporate profits. 38% of those surveyed said public health has been harmed by agency practices that defer to business interests. 1 in 4 directly experienced situations where corporate interests have forced the withdrawal or significant modification of an agency policy or action designed to protect consumers or public health. So they are quietly getting away with promoting business interests. But with GMOs, it is not quiet, it is mandated. When Lester Crawford gave a presentation to the dairy industry, his PowerPoint had 2 goals and purposes of the FDA, and the second one was to promote biotechnology. And as soon as he left the FDA, he admitted that he admitted to fraud, personally. So that gives you a sense of who's at the helm of the FDA. When L-tryptophan was discovered to have created a deadly epidemic in the 1980s, they found it was only one company's L-tryptophan, Showa-Denko, that was causing the problem. It caused 5,000 to 10,000 people to fall sick or become permanently disabled, about 100 deaths. But Showa-Denko was the only company that was genetically engineering bacteria to produce the L-tryptophan more economically. When the FDA representative testified before Congress about the epidemic, he never mentioned genetic engineering. They took all tryptophan off the market. The current policy of the FDA is based on this sentence, 1992, saying basically the agency is not aware of any information showing that GMOs are significantly different. On the basis of this sentence, there's no required safety studies whatsoever on GMOs. No labeling. You don't even have to tell the FDA if you want to introduce a GMO. What was actually said at the FDA, we now know from documents made public from a lawsuit, is that the processes of genetic engineering and traditional breeding are different, and according to the technical experts at the agency, they lead to different risks. Completely the opposite of what the public policy said. They even described increased levels of existing toxins, new toxins, gathering toxins from the environment, nutritional problems, recommending toxicological studies and long-term, even human studies. One scientist said there is a profound difference between the types of unexpected genetic effects from traditional breeding and genetic engineering, and then in reference to the policy, this is the industry's pet idea, namely that there are no unintended side effects. Who overruled the scientists? Well, the person in charge of policy was Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, and later Monsanto's vice president, now the U.S. food safety czar. The person who I believe is responsible for more human food-related deaths in human history is in charge of the food safety supply. Now, it wasn't just him. He was recruited. There was a position created for him because the White House had given instructions to the FDA, which was revealed in this note from the then commissioner, David Kessler, who handed the policy off to the White House saying, this is consistent with the general biotechnology policy established by the Office of the President, and that included the safe and speedy introduction of genetic engineered products. However, when he handed it off to the White House, it still wasn't good enough. The Office of Management Budget said, no, we should say specifically that these techniques are more precise, that they increase the potential for safe, better characterized, and more predictable foods. The Assistant Secretary for Health said, the environmental section, which was 12 pages, gives an incorrect impression that biotechnology raises significant new agricultural and environmental concerns. So